Once you have the main idea of your passage, now your next step, you don't have a sermon yet. You might have the main idea of your passage, and you might even have an outline of your passage, as we said before. But you don't yet have a sermon because remember, your exegetical idea, your exegetical proposition only talks about what did the passage say to its original readers. Now you've got to bridge the gap between the original readers of the text and the present hearers of your sermon. What that means is that you're going to now begin to move toward this next step of what in this ancient text still communicates to 21st century men and women who are not necessarily living in the same kind of world. It's not as much of an agricultural world. It's an industrial technological world. It's not a world that is as steeped in religious faith, perhaps, especially in Western culture, but is steeped in some skepticism and some doubt. So how do I translate the ancient text into a statement, a proposition that will speak to modern day hearers? This next step, this is what's called the homiletical proposition. So we had the exegetical proposition, which is the main idea of the text. Now we want to move toward the homiletical proposition, which is the main idea of your sermon. Homiletics is just the study of preaching. So a homiletical proposition is the preaching idea. This is the main idea that you're going to say maybe more than once, in fact, probably more than once in the course of your sermon. It should be memorable, translated into current terminology, easy for people to understand, and easy in some respects to apply. It should lead you toward application. So, how do I get to the homiletical proposition? Here's what I tend to do, and people have all kinds of ways of doing this. But what I do is once I have the exegetical idea and a basic outline, now I think, what am I trying to accomplish with this sermon? That's called a purpose statement. There's a great book by Ramesh Richard, Preparing Expository Sermons, where he talks about this concept, and he uses the terminology of a purpose bridge. The idea is once you have your exegetical proposition, now think, what am I trying to accomplish? What do I want this sermon to do in the lives of its hearers? It helps if you think, what was this passage supposed to do in the lives of the original readers? What was it meant to accomplish? And what am I meant to accomplish in this sermon? So let's go back to our idea from Colossians chapter 1, verses 13 to 23. My purpose statement was something like this. I want to convince my congregation that arranging their lives around knowing and following Jesus is the greatest decision they can make. All right? I want to convince my congregation that arranging their lives around knowing and following Jesus is the greatest decision they can make. So once I do that, I want them to believe something. I want to convince them, and that's going to lead to application. That's going to clarify how I state my homiletical proposition. So as I'm looking at it, and I look at my text and I go, okay, Jesus saves us from sin and death. Jesus rules over all of the universe, including my own future and life. Jesus brings me peace with God. I go, okay, what I want people to believe is Jesus is worthy of my trust. Jesus is worthy of my life. Why? Because he's my rescuer, he's my ruler, and he's my reconciler. Jesus is worthy of my life because he's my rescuer, my ruler, and my reconciler. Now, all of a sudden, I have put this in terms that people go, okay, it matters what Jesus has done for me because now I'm going to want to arrange my life around knowing and following him. So it's leading me toward application. Just like the exegetical proposition, your homiletical proposition needs to have a subject and a complement. So for James, let's go back to James 1 again, our second illustration. Remember, the subject was how can we respond to trials and temptation in a way that leads us closer to God rather than farther away from him. The complement for my homiletical proposition, we can respond by rejecting sin's lies and by trusting God's grace. So as I looked at James 1, I said, what is my purpose? My purpose is to explain to the congregation what they need to remember and keep in mind when they're facing trials that lead to temptation. right? So I want to help them, in other words, to avoid sin in the face of trials and to pursue trusting in God, right? So that's my purpose. I want them to say, you know what? I'm in the midst of a trial. And instead of believing that God's out to get me or God's trying to push me away, I'm going to believe that God has what's best in mind for me. So I'm going to trust him and I'm going to obey him even in the face of trials. So I want that mindset. That's my purpose. So I framed my main idea like this. When you face trials, reject sin's lies and trust in God's grace. All right. So what are you going to do when you face trials? You're going to reject the lies of sin. In other words, you're going to say, I'm choosing not to believe that God is trying to tempt me. God is trying to hurt me. God is trying to lead me down a bad path. Instead, I will trust that God is a giver. God is good. God is righteous, right? So I'm wanting them to rearrange their thought processes, and that's going to lead to a rearranging of their lives in light of God's character. All right, so that's the idea. I'm going to now think about Susie and Bill and Sarah and all of these people in my congregation, young and old, and go, what do they need to hear from this text? What kinds of trials are they facing? They may be facing the loss of a loved one or sickness or the perils of aging or the uncertainty of a future if they're especially younger or in high school or college, or a challenging marriage or a challenging child or whatever it may be. They're facing these trials. They are going to be tempted to say, God doesn't have what's best for me. God is trying to harm me. God is not on my side. I want them to reject those thoughts and instead tell themselves, God is good. God is a giver of all good gifts. I can trust that because Jesus died for me. Jesus rose again for me. Jesus is present with me, and he's leading my life in a good direction. So even in the face of trials, reject sin's lies and trust in God's grace. You see how we do that? We move now from here's what the text was saying to the original audience. Now, how does that translate to the lives of my hearers? And the key is that purpose bridge. I go, I want to convince this congregation to think differently about who God is in the face of trials, to remember that God is not evil or leading them to evil, but God is good and a giver of good gifts. Once I get there, then I can frame it in a way that they will understand. All right. This is going to take you some time, by the way. Every week, this main idea might be the hardest aspect of sermon preparation, with the possible exception of your illustrations, which we'll talk about in a little while. But you want to be able to frame the main idea of your sermon in a single, memorable sentence that derives from the text. This is really important. It has to come from the text, and it has to communicate to the listeners right in front of you how their lives need to be reshaped in response to this text. That's hard to do. So you should expect to spend a good deal of time reshaping, recrafting this main homiletical proposition, this main idea of your text, and you may go through several iterations of it before you hit on one that works from the text for your congregation. If it's not from the text, then you're liable to be preaching heresy. If it's not applicable to the congregation, then it doesn't really matter what you're saying because they won't care or adjust their lives. So it's got to come from the text and speak into their lives. You've got to bridge that gap. So here's the exercise. Again, before we go to the next video, go back to Philippians 2, 1 through 4, and take your exegetical proposition from the last session. And now let's rework it into a homiletical proposition. Begin with your purpose statement, often framed again as an infinitive. If you're in Philippians 2, what is it that you want the congregation you're preaching to think differently, to believe differently, to feel differently, or to do differently as a result? What are you trying to accomplish? And then from there, write a homiletical proposition for Philippians 2:4 with a subject and a complement. What are you talking about, right? What is the main idea, the main subject, and what do you want to say about that subject into the lives of the people you're speaking to? So spend a little bit of time working on that from Philippians 2, and then we'll see you in the next session.